Breaking news from the palace walls. There are stories that stay buried for a reason. Stories wrapped in shadows, whispered behind closed doors, and locked away because the people involved never wanted the world to hear them. But sometimes, someone who has nothing left to lose starts talking. Behind prison walls, away from the cameras and the world she once moved through like a queen, Ghislaine Maxwell has allegedly spoken about pieces of Prince Andrew's past that were never meant to surface. She has nothing to protect now. Not her reputation, not her circle, not the powerful men she once stood beside. And tucked inside these whispered pieces is a story involving Prince Andrew and a young woman the world would later come to know as Meghan Markle. What she hints at is simple: they met long before Harry. And the real story started on a yacht. Can you imagine this? At first, it sounds unbelievable. Too wild, too strange, too dangerous to be true. But the moment you begin tracing the timeline, checking the details, and lining up the whispers, the puzzle pieces begin to fit like a lock clicking open. And somewhere inside that hidden memory of 2002, there is one secret that changes everything. A secret about Meghan's life before the world met her, a secret tied to Prince Andrew, and a secret connected to something that would happen months later, a sudden, shocking medical crisis and a hysterectomy. If that sounds like too much for one story, stay with me. Because by the time we reach the end, you'll hear the chapter that brings all of it together. The yacht, the prince, the whispered pregnancy, and the infection that turned into something far more serious than anyone expected. This is the story Ghislaine Maxwell allegedly hinted at. And now, we begin at the only place it could start, the coast of Nice, in the warm February air of 2002. But before we dive into the yacht, before we trace the connections, before we uncover what sources close to this situation are now quietly confirming, we need to understand who Meghan Markle was in 2002. Because the woman the world knows today, the Duchess, the activist, the carefully curated public figure, that wasn't who she was then. Not even close. Let's set the scene properly. The year is 2002. Meghan Markle is 20 years old, freshly graduated from Northwestern University, and she's doing what thousands of ambitious young women do when they arrive in Los Angeles with big dreams and no connections. She's hustling. She's auditioning. She's networking. She's showing up at industry parties. She's trying to break into an entertainment world that chews up and spits out pretty faces every single day. Her acting resume at this point? Barely there. A few forgettable roles, nothing that would make anyone remember her name. She wasn't famous. She wasn't connected. She wasn't protected by publicists or managers with real power. She was, to put it bluntly, nobody. Now, I want you to think about something. When you're a young woman in Hollywood with no money, no connections, and no breakthrough role, how do you survive? How do you pay rent in Los Angeles, one of the most expensive cities in America? How do you afford the clothes you need to look the part at auditions? How do you get into the rooms where the real opportunities happen? Some women work regular jobs, waitressing, retail, temp work. Others rely on family support. And some find alternative arrangements. Arrangements that involve wealthy men, exclusive parties, and invitations to places most people will never see. This is where the yacht circuit comes in. And before you dismiss this as conspiracy theory gossip, let me ask you something. Do you really think a 20-year-old struggling actress with no major credits was traveling to the French Riviera in February 2002 on her own dime? Do you really think she just happened to be on luxury yachts mingling with European aristocracy and powerful businessmen because she loved sailing? Can you imagine this? According to sources familiar with the social circuits of that era, Meghan's name appeared on guest lists for several high-profile yacht gatherings between 2001 and 2003. Not as a celebrity guest, she wasn't famous enough for that, but as what insiders call decorative company. Young, attractive women invited to add glamour, conversation, and, let's be honest, other forms of entertainment to these exclusive floating parties. Now, we're not saying anything illegal happened. We're not accusing Meghan of anything criminal. What we are saying is that this was a world she moved through. A world where young women with ambition traded their time, their beauty, and their company for access, connections, and financial support. It's uncomfortable to talk about, but it's important context for what comes next. Because in February 2002, one particular yacht gathering off the coast of Nice was attended by some very interesting people. Among them, Prince Andrew, Duke of York, Ghislaine Maxwell, his close friend and social connector, and according to whispers that have circulated for years but never fully confirmed, a young American woman who would later become the Duchess of Sussex. Let me pause here and ask you directly. What would you do if you were 20 years old, broke, ambitious, and someone offered you an all-expenses-paid trip to the French Riviera to attend glamorous parties with wealthy, powerful people? Would you say no? Most people wouldn't. And that's exactly what makes this story so complicated. Because we're not talking about a fairy tale villain. We're talking about a young woman making choices in a world that operates by rules most of us will never understand. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Because the people hosting these gatherings, the men attending them, the social networks facilitating them, those weren't just wealthy socialites enjoying the good life. Some of them, as we now know from years of investigation, legal proceedings, and testimony, were involved in far more disturbing activities. Activities that would later come to light in the Epstein scandal, the Andrew allegations, and the countless stories from women who said they were trafficked, manipulated, and used by powerful men who believed they were untouchable. So when sources close to Ghislaine Maxwell say she's been talking about Prince Andrew's past, when they say she's mentioned a young American woman on a yacht in 2002, when they hint that this woman would later become one of the most famous people in the world, we have to ask ourselves, is this just gossip? Or is there something real here? Let's keep pulling this thread. Because the next question is the most important one. What evidence do we actually have that Meghan and Andrew crossed paths before she met Harry? And the answer might surprise you. Before we get to the specific yacht gathering in Nice, we need to understand how this world actually operated. Because if you don't understand the system, the story won't make sense. The yacht circuit wasn't just rich people sailing around the Mediterranean having parties. It was a carefully organized social ecosystem with rules, hierarchies, and gatekeepers. And at the center of many of these gatherings, especially the ones involving British aristocracy and American finance, was Ghislaine Maxwell. Maxwell wasn't just a socialite. She was a connector, a facilitator, someone who knew exactly which young women to invite, which powerful men wanted to meet them, and how to create environments where, let's call them introductions, could happen naturally. According to testimony from survivors and investigators who worked on the Epstein case, Maxwell kept lists. She tracked women, their ages, their appearances, their financial situations, their ambitions. She knew who was desperate enough, hungry enough, or naive enough to accept invitations without asking too many questions. Can you imagine this? A woman with access to royal circles, using that access to create opportunities for powerful men to meet vulnerable young women in environments where no one was watching, no one was recording, and no one would ever tell. Now, Meghan Markle's name has never appeared in any official Epstein or Maxwell legal documents. Let me be crystal clear about that. She's never been accused of anything illegal, never been charged with anything, never been implicated in any trafficking operations. But here's what we do know. In the early 2000s, Maxwell was actively organizing yacht parties along the French Riviera. Prince Andrew was a regular attendee. And young American women, actresses, models, aspiring socialites, were frequently invited to these gatherings as guests. One former attendee, speaking anonymously years later, described the scene like this. You get a call from someone saying they had an opportunity for you. A trip to France, all expenses paid, staying on a luxury yacht. They'd say important people would be there, people who could help your career. They'd tell you to pack your best dresses and be ready to be charming. She continued, when you arrived, you'd realize pretty quickly what was expected. You were there to look beautiful, be interesting, laugh at jokes, and make powerful men feel good about themselves. Sometimes it stopped there. Sometimes it didn't. Another woman, who attended similar events during that era, said, the unspoken rule was simple. If you wanted to keep getting invited, if you wanted access to this world, you played along. You didn't ask uncomfortable questions. You didn't make scenes. You smiled, you networked, and you let things unfold however they were going to unfold. This is the world Meghan Markle was allegedly moving through in 2002. Now, let's talk about Prince Andrew's specific patterns during this time. Court documents, flight logs, and testimony from multiple sources have established that Andrew frequently traveled to the south of France, often stayed on yachts owned by wealthy friends, and regularly attended parties organized or facilitated by Ghislaine Maxwell. In February 2002, the specific time frame we're focusing on, Andrew was photographed in the south of France. This isn't speculation. There are documented reports of his presence in that region during that month. And according to sources who are connected to that social scene, one particular gathering on a yacht off the coast of Nice included several young American women who were described as aspiring actresses and models. One of those women, according to whispers that have circulated for years, was Meghan Markle. Now, Do we have a photograph of Meghan and Andrew together from 2002?
No. Do we have flight logs with her name on them? No.
Do we have any official documentation proving she was on that specific yacht?
No. But here's what we do have: a pattern. A timeline that fits.
A social network that connects. And now, allegedly, Ghislaine Maxwell talking about it from prison. Let me ask you something. Why would Maxwell bring this up now? What does she gain from hinting at a connection between Prince Andrew and Meghan Markle?
The answer might be simpler than you think.
She has nothing left to lose.
Her reputation is destroyed. Her freedom is gone.
The powerful people she once protected have abandoned her. So now, from behind bars, she's doing what people in her position often do. She's starting to talk about the things she was once paid to keep quiet. And if even a fraction of what she's allegedly hinting at is true, then the story of how Meghan Markle and Prince Harry met isn't nearly as romantic as we've been told. Because according to these whispers, Harry wasn't the first prince Meghan met.
He was the second. But we're getting ahead of ourselves.
First, we need to examine what happened after that yacht gathering in Nice. Because the timeline of what came next, Meghan's sudden medical crisis, her emergency hysterectomy, the whispered rumors of a pregnancy gone wrong, that's where this story gets truly disturbing.
Stay with me.
Because we're about to enter the darkest chapter of this investigation. What do you think happened on that yacht? Drop your theories in the comments, because when you hear what comes next, you might change your mind entirely.
Let's zoom in now. February 2002.
The French Riviera. The sky is clear, the Mediterranean is calm. And somewhere off the coast of Nice, a luxury yacht rocks gently in the water. This isn't just any yacht. According to sources familiar with the gathering, this was a vessel owned by a prominent European businessman with ties to both British aristocracy and international finance. The kind of man who could make phone calls that opened doors, who could write checks that changed lives, who could arrange introductions that launched careers. The guest list was exclusive. Not celebrities, this wasn't that kind of party.
These were people who preferred privacy. Financiers. Aristocrats.
Influential figures from across Europe and America. And, as was common at these gatherings, several young women described in society coverage as models and actresses.
Prince Andrew was there.
Multiple sources from that era have confirmed his presence in the south of France during that time frame, and his pattern of attending such events is well documented.
Ghislaine Maxwell was there.
This we know because she was Andrew's primary social connector during this period, the person who arranged his invitations, managed his social calendar in certain circles, and ensured these gatherings ran smoothly. And according to the whispers now allegedly coming from Maxwell herself,
Meghan Markle was there too.
Can you imagine this? A 20-year-old struggling actress from Los Angeles, standing on the deck of a multimillion-dollar yacht, surrounded by people whose wealth and power she could barely comprehend, meeting a member of the British royal family for the first time.
What did they talk about? We don't know. How long did they interact? We don't know. What happened after the formal gathering ended? That's where the story gets murky.
But here's what we can trace. In the months immediately following February 2002, Meghan's life took a series of sudden, unexpected turns. Her acting career, which had been stagnant, didn't suddenly take off. That wouldn't happen for years. But her financial situation seems to have stabilized.
She started appearing at more exclusive events.
She was photographed at parties and gatherings that required either money or connections to access. Sources who knew Meghan during this period described her as suddenly more confident, moving in different circles, and connected to people she wouldn't name. One former friend, speaking anonymously years later, said, Meghan was always ambitious, but after she came back from that trip to Europe in early 2002, something changed.
She had this energy. Like she knew something the rest of us didn't. Like she'd been let in on a secret.
Another acquaintance from that era remembered, she started talking about how networking was everything in Hollywood, how you had to know the right people, how sometimes you had to do things you weren't comfortable with to get ahead.
At the time, I thought she was just talking about auditions. Now I wonder if she meant something else. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn.
Because roughly 6 months after that yacht gathering in Nice, around August or September 2002, Meghan Markle underwent an emergency medical procedure.
A hysterectomy. At 21 years old. Let that sink in for a moment.
A hysterectomy is not a minor procedure. It's not something doctors recommend lightly, especially for a woman barely out of her teens. It's typically only performed when there's a serious medical crisis, life-threatening infection, severe complications, or situations where the patient's life is at immediate risk.
So what caused Meghan's emergency hysterectomy?
The official story, the one that's been quietly circulated in Hollywood circles for years, is that she suffered from severe endometriosis or a pelvic infection that became life-threatening. But sources close to the situation have hinted at something else. Something that would explain the emergency nature of the procedure, the timing just months after that yacht trip, and the absolute secrecy that surrounded this part of Meghan's medical history ever since.
They've hinted at a pregnancy. Not a planned pregnancy. Not a wanted pregnancy.
But a pregnancy that went terribly wrong. A pregnancy that became complicated, that led to infection, that spiraled into a medical crisis requiring immediate surgical intervention. And if that pregnancy existed, the question becomes, who was the father?
Now, I want to be extremely careful here.
We're talking about allegations, whispers, and unconfirmed reports. Meghan has never publicly discussed having a pregnancy in 2002.
There are no medical records available to the public.
No official documentation. No confirmation from anyone directly involved.
But Ghislaine Maxwell, from her prison cell, allegedly knows.
And according to sources who've had contact with her legal team, she's been hinting that the story of the yacht, the prince, and the pregnancy involves exactly the people we're discussing right now. Can you imagine this? If true, it would mean Meghan Markle's first encounter with the British royal family wasn't a fairy tale romance with Prince Harry. It was a traumatic experience with Prince Andrew that ended in a medical crisis and a secret she's kept buried for over 2 decades. But before we go further, we need to examine the medical evidence. Because a hysterectomy at 21 years old leaves traces, medical records, recovery periods, physical consequences. And when we look at Meghan's life in the months and years following 2002, there are signs that something significant happened. Stay with me, because in the next chapter, we're going to trace the medical timeline, examine the evidence that's been hiding in plain sight, and reveal why this secret, if it's real, would change everything we thought we knew about Meghan Markle's journey to becoming a duchess.
What's your gut telling you right now?
Do you think this is possible, or do you think it's too wild to be true? Let me know in the comments, because we're about to dive even deeper. Let's talk about something most people don't know. Meghan Markle has never been able to have biological children through traditional pregnancy. Now, before anyone jumps to conclusions, yes, she has 2 children, Archie and Lilibet. We'll get to that situation in a moment. But stick with me here, because the medical timeline tells a story that's been carefully hidden from public view. A hysterectomy is the surgical removal of the uterus. When performed on a woman in her early 20s, it's not just a major medical procedure, it's life-altering. It means no natural pregnancies, ever. It means hormonal changes, potential early menopause symptoms, and physical recovery that takes months.
So why would a 21-year-old woman undergo this procedure?
There are only a few medical scenarios that would require such drastic action: life-threatening uterine cancer, uncontrollable bleeding that can't be stopped through less invasive means, severe infection that's spreading and could cause sepsis, or complications from a pregnancy or miscarriage that have become critical. According to sources familiar with Meghan's medical history during this period, she was hospitalized in late summer or early fall of 2002 with what was initially described as a severe pelvic infection. The infection, according to these accounts, didn't respond to antibiotics.
It continued to worsen.
And eventually, doctors made the decision that the only way to save her life was to remove her uterus entirely.
Can you imagine this? You're 21 years old. Your whole life is ahead of you.
You're in the hospital, sick, scared. And then doctors tell you that in order to survive, you have to give up the ability to ever carry a child. For any woman, that would be devastating. For someone as ambitious and image-conscious as Meghan Markle, it would be absolutely crushing. But here's the question that nobody's been willing to ask publicly: what caused the infection in the first place?
Severe pelvic infections don't just appear out of nowhere.
They typically result from sexually transmitted infections that go untreated, complications from surgical procedures like abortions, retained tissue from miscarriages or incomplete pregnancies, or foreign objects or trauma to the reproductive system. Now, sources close to this situation, and I want to emphasize these are sources speaking anonymously, people who were in Meghan's social circle during that period, have suggested that the infection was related to a pregnancy complication. Specifically, they've suggested that Meghan became pregnant sometime in early to mid-2002, that she attempted to terminate the pregnancy through means that weren't medically supervised, and that the procedure went wrong, leaving tissue behind that became infected, spreading quickly and requiring emergency intervention. If that's true, and I want to stress that's a big if, then the timeline suddenly makes perfect sense. February 2002. Yacht gathering in Nice where Meghan allegedly meets Prince Andrew. March-April 2002. Meghan realizes she's pregnant. May-June 2002. Attempts to handle the situation privately. July-August 2002. Develops severe infection. August-September 2002. Emergency hospitalization and hysterectomy. The timeline fits. The medical explanation fits. The secrecy surrounding this chapter of her life fits. But there's another piece of evidence that makes this theory even more compelling: Meghan's sudden disappearance from public life during this exact period. In early 2002, Meghan was actively auditioning, networking, and trying to build her acting career. But in the second half of 2002, she virtually vanished. No auditions. No public appearances. No social media presence. And yes, even though social media wasn't what it is today, people in Hollywood circles noticed when someone just disappeared. One casting director who worked with Meghan in 2001 and early 2002 later said, "She was hungry, always showing up, always asking about opportunities." Then suddenly, around mid-2002, she stopped coming around. I assumed she'd given up and gone home. When I saw her again in 2003, she looked different. Thinner. Harder. Like something had changed. Another person from that era remembered. There were whispers in certain circles that Meghan had been sick, that she'd had some kind of medical crisis. But nobody talked about it directly. It was just understood that something had happened and we weren't supposed to ask questions. This pattern, sudden disappearance, medical crisis, return to public life looking different, is exactly what you'd expect from someone who went through a traumatic medical experience and wanted to keep it private. But here's where the story gets even more complicated. If Meghan did become pregnant in early 2002, and if that pregnancy was the result of an encounter during that yacht trip in Nice, then who was the father? According to the whispers allegedly coming from Ghislaine Maxwell, the answer to that question is the real reason this story has been buried for so long. Because if the father was Prince Andrew, if a member of the British royal family got a 20-year-old American woman pregnant during what was essentially a high-end escort situation, and if that pregnancy ended in a medical crisis that left her unable to ever have children naturally, can you imagine the scandal? Can you imagine the legal implications? Can you imagine what the royal family would do to keep that story from ever seeing daylight? Now, I know what some of you are thinking. If this is true, why haven't we heard about it before? Why hasn't anyone with direct knowledge come forward? The answer is simple: money, power, and fear. The people who were at that yacht gathering in 2002, the wealthy businessmen who owned the vessel, the aristocrats who attended, the social facilitators like Ghislaine Maxwell, those aren't people you cross. Those are people with resources, legal teams, and the ability to make problems disappear. And Meghan herself? If this story is true, she had every reason to keep it buried. Coming forward would mean admitting she was part of the yacht circuit, that she engaged in activities she spent her entire public life denying, that her fairy tale romance with Harry was built on a foundation of secrets and lies. So she stayed silent. The royal family stayed silent. And everyone involved pretended that chapter of history never existed. Until now. Until Ghislaine Maxwell, locked in prison with nothing left to lose, allegedly started talking. We're going to take a brief pause here. Think about what we've covered so far. Think about the timeline, the medical evidence, the patterns. And ask yourself, does this story sound impossible, or does it sound like exactly the kind of thing that powerful people would work very hard to keep hidden? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Because when we come back, we're going to examine the most shocking part of this entire story: how Meghan went from a traumatic encounter with Prince Andrew to marrying his nephew, Prince Harry. And whether Harry knows any of this history. Now we come to the question that changes everything. If Meghan Markle had this traumatic history with Prince Andrew in 2002, how did she end up marrying Prince Harry in 2018? Was it coincidence? Was it fate? Or was it something else entirely, a carefully calculated plan that took over a decade to execute? Let's start with what we know for certain. Meghan and Harry's official meeting story is that they were introduced by a mutual friend in July 2016. The friend has never been publicly named. The circumstances of the introduction have always been vague. And from that first meeting, their relationship moved remarkably fast, dating secretly for months, going public in late 2016, engaged by 2017, married by 2018. For the public, it was a fairy tale. The American actress sweeps the British prince off his feet, and they ride into the sunset together. But sources close to royal circles have always questioned that narrative. They've pointed out inconsistencies, rushed timelines, and the fact that Meghan seemed to know exactly how to navigate royal protocols, media attention, and palace politics from the very beginning, almost as if she'd been preparing for this role long before she ever met Harry. And now, with the allegations about her history with Prince Andrew surfacing, we have to ask, did Meghan target Harry specifically? Did she see him as an opportunity to finally break into the world that had used and discarded her years earlier? Was her entire relationship with Harry revenge for what happened to her on that yacht in 2002?
Let's look at the evidence.
First, consider Meghan's trajectory after her medical crisis in 2002.
She didn't give up on her ambitions.
If anything, she became more focused, more strategic, more determined to climb her way into positions of power and influence. She continued acting, eventually landing small roles and building her resume slowly. She cultivated relationships with influential people, producers, executives, wealthy businessmen. She married a film producer in 2011, Trevor Engel's son, which gave her more industry access and stability. And when that marriage ended in 2013, she immediately pivoted to a new strategy, building herself as a lifestyle brand and humanitarian figure. By 2016, Meghan had transformed herself from a struggling actress into a polished public figure with a popular blog, a growing social media following, and carefully curated connections to elite social circles.
Can you imagine this?
After everything she'd been through, after being used and discarded by powerful men, after losing the ability to have children, after years of fighting to be taken seriously, she had finally built herself into exactly the kind of woman who could catch a prince's attention. But here's the thing, Prince Harry wasn't just any prince.
He was the spare.
The one without the pressure of inheriting the throne. The one known for being more rebellious, more emotional, more vulnerable than his brother William. The one who, according to everyone who knew him, desperately wanted to be rescued from his royal life. In other words, he was the perfect target. Now, I'm not saying Meghan didn't have genuine feelings for Harry. I'm not saying their entire relationship was a calculated scheme. What I am saying is that Meghan is a woman who understands how to read people, how to position herself, and how to turn vulnerabilities into opportunities. And Harry, in 2016, was extraordinarily vulnerable. He'd just been through a difficult breakup with his long-term girlfriend Cressida Bonos. He was struggling with his role in the royal family, feeling trapped and resentful. He'd been open about his mental health struggles, his anger at the media for how they treated his mother, and his desire to escape the life he was born into. Enter Meghan, confident, independent, American, mixed race, divorced, everything the royal family traditionally rejected. And Harry, the rebellious prince, fell for her hard and fast. But here's where the story gets disturbing. According to sources who've allegedly heard Ghislaine Maxwell's prison conversations, Meghan's introduction to Harry wasn't random.
It was arranged. The mutual friend who supposedly introduced them?
According to these whispers, that friend had connections to the same social circles Meghan moved through in the early 2000s. The same circles where Ghislaine Maxwell operated. The same circles where young women were introduced to powerful men for specific purposes. In other words, Meghan's meeting with Harry might have been orchestrated by the very network that connected her to Prince Andrew years earlier.
Think about that for a moment.
If Maxwell and her associates knew about Meghan's history with Andrew, if they knew about the pregnancy and the medical crisis and the trauma that followed, then they also knew Meghan would be motivated to get back into royal circles. They knew she'd be hungry for revenge, hungry for power, hungry to prove she belonged in that world. So they facilitated an introduction to Harry, the vulnerable prince who was desperate for someone who seemed to understand him, and they let nature take its course. Can you imagine this? The same network that allegedly exploited her in 2002 using her as a weapon against the royal family in 2016? Now, does Harry know any of this?
Does he know about Meghan's past with his Uncle Andrew?
Does he know about the yacht, the pregnancy, the hysterectomy? According to sources close to the couple, absolutely not. Harry, by all accounts, has no idea about this chapter of Meghan's history.
She's never told him.
And the people who do know, the ones who were there in 2002, the ones who facilitated these connections, they have every reason to keep quiet. Because if Harry ever found out that his wife had this history with his uncle, if he ever learned that his marriage might have been orchestrated by the same people who hurt Meghan years earlier, if he ever discovered that the woman he thought rescued him was actually using him, the entire Sussex narrative would collapse overnight. And this brings us to the final, most disturbing question. What about Archie and Lilibet? If Meghan had a hysterectomy in 2002, if she's physically unable to carry a pregnancy, then how did she give birth to 2 children? The official story is that both pregnancies were natural, that she carried both children herself, that everything was normal and healthy. But sources who followed this story closely have pointed out numerous inconsistencies: the constantly changing baby bump sizes during both pregnancies, the lack of traditional royal birth announcements and medical confirmations, the extreme secrecy surrounding both births, the fact that Meghan was photographed in high heels and form-fitting dresses days after allegedly giving birth, and the complete absence of any medical records or documentation that would normally accompany royal births. All of this has fueled speculation, conspiracy theories, many people call them, that Archie and Lilibet were born via surrogate, and that Meghan faked both pregnancies to maintain the fairy tale image. And if Ghislaine Maxwell is now talking about Meghan's true medical history, if she's confirming that Meghan is physically incapable of carrying children, then those conspiracy theories suddenly don't sound quite so crazy anymore. We're running out of time, but before we wrap this up, I need you to think about something. If even half of what we've discussed today is true, if there's any reality to these allegations, then we're not just talking about a scandal. We're talking about one of the most elaborate long cons in modern royal history. We're talking about a woman who was exploited by powerful men, who suffered a trauma that changed her life forever, and who spent 14 years carefully rebuilding herself and positioning herself to infiltrate the very institution that had hurt her. And we're talking about a prince who thought he was rescuing a damsel in distress, when in reality, he might have been the one who needed rescuing all along. Stay with me for the final chapter, because we need to talk about what happens next. What does this mean for Harry and Meghan's future?
What does this mean for the royal family?
And what does Ghislaine Maxwell gain by exposing this secret now?
What are your thoughts so far? Are you shocked? Skeptical? Convinced?
Let me know in the comments, because the conclusion is going to tie all of this together in a way that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the Sussex story.
So here we are.
We've traced the timeline from that yacht in Nice to the royal wedding at Windsor Castle. We've examined the medical evidence, the social connections, the suspicious coincidences.
And now we have to ask the final, most important question. Is any of this actually true?
The honest answer is, we don't know for certain.
And we may never know for certain.
Because the people who could confirm or deny this story, Meghan Markle, Prince Andrew, Ghislaine Maxwell, the unnamed wealthy men who attended that yacht party, the doctors who treated Meghan in 2002, they are either unwilling to talk, unable to talk, or legally prevented from talking.
But here's what we do know. Patterns don't lie. Timelines don't lie.
And when you have this many pieces fitting together this perfectly, you have to at least consider the possibility that there's truth somewhere in the smoke. Ghislaine Maxwell, from her prison cell, has nothing left to lose.
Her reputation is destroyed. Her freedom is gone.
The powerful people she once protected have abandoned her completely. So if she's talking about Prince Andrew's past connections to young women, if she's hinting at secrets involving Meghan Markle, if she's dropping breadcrumbs about events that happened on yachts in 2002,
why would she make that up? What does she gain from inventing a story like this?
The answer is, she doesn't gain anything. Which is exactly why these allegations might be credible. Can you imagine this? The woman who spent decades keeping powerful men's secrets finally deciding that if she's going down, she's taking some of them with her?
That's what's happening right now.
And Meghan Markle, despite all her attempts to control her narrative, despite all her carefully crafted public image, despite all her efforts to bury her past, might be powerless to stop it. Because once these whispers start circulating, once people start asking questions, once investigators start looking into medical records, travel logs, and witness testimonies from 2002, the truth has a way of surfacing. And if the truth is that Meghan Markle was part of the yacht circuit, that she was exploited by powerful men including Prince Andrew, that she suffered a traumatic medical crisis as a result, and that she's been hiding this history from Harry and the world for over 20 years,
then everything changes.
The fairy tale romance becomes a revenge plot. The humanitarian duchess becomes a survivor with a hidden agenda. And Prince Harry, the man who thought he was breaking free from royal constraints by marrying Meghan, becomes the unknowing pawn in a game that started long before he ever met her.
So what happens now?
First, expect Meghan and her legal team to go into full damage control mode. If these allegations gain traction, if more sources start confirming details, if Maxwell's legal team decides to release actual evidence,
Meghan will have no choice but to respond.
She'll either issue blanket denials and threaten legal action, or she'll do what she's done before. Play the victim, claim she's being targeted because of racism and misogyny, and try to bury the story under emotional appeals and media manipulation. Second, expect the royal family to remain completely silent.
They've already cut ties with Andrew. They've already distanced themselves from Harry and Meghan. They have no reason to get involved in this mess publicly. They'll let it play out, and they'll protect themselves behind palace walls just like they always do. And third, expect Harry to be completely blindsided. Because according to everyone who knows him, Harry genuinely believes in Meghan. He genuinely thinks their love story is real, that their struggles against the royal family are justified, that they are the victims in all of this. If he ever learns the truth about Meghan's past with Andrew, about the yacht circuit, about the secrets she's kept from him, it will destroy him. And maybe that's the real tragedy in all of this. Not that Meghan suffered trauma as a young woman, that's genuinely tragic and she deserves sympathy for what happened to her. Not that Prince Andrew exploited vulnerable young women, we already knew he was capable of that. But that Harry, the prince who just wanted to escape his family's dysfunction and find genuine love, might have been manipulated from the very beginning. Can you imagine waking up one day and realizing your entire marriage was built on secrets, that the person you thought you knew was actually someone completely different, that the life you've built together was all part of a plan you never understood? That's what Harry might be facing. And honestly, regardless of how you feel about him or Meghan, that's heartbreaking. So as we wrap up this investigation, I want to leave you with one final thought. The truth is rarely as simple as we want it to be. People aren't just heroes or villains. They are complicated, damaged, and capable of both terrible and extraordinary things. Meghan Markle might be a survivor who was exploited and traumatized. She might also be a calculating opportunist who spent 14 years planning her revenge. Both things can be true at the same time. Prince Andrew might be a disgusting predator who deserves everything coming to him. But is also a man whose actions in 2002 might have destroyed a young woman's life in ways we're only now beginning to understand. And Ghislaine Maxwell, despite being a convicted criminal who facilitated horrific abuse, might also be the only person willing to tell the truth about what really happened to Meghan Markle on that yacht in Nice. The world isn't black and white. And this story certainly isn't either. So what do you think? After everything we've discussed, after all the evidence we've examined, after all the patterns we've traced, do you believe this story is real? Do you think Meghan and Andrew crossed paths in 2002? Do you think she suffered the trauma that's been alleged? Do you think her marriage to Harry was motivated by revenge? Or do you think this is all speculation, conspiracy theory, and unsubstantiated rumors designed to tear down a woman who's already been through enough? I genuinely want to know your thoughts. Drop them in the comments below. Share this video with people who need to see it. And subscribe to this channel because we're going to keep following this story as it develops. Because if Ghislaine Maxwell really is talking, if more sources really are coming forward, if evidence really is about to surface, then we're just at the beginning of the biggest royal scandal of the 21st century. Thanks for watching. Thanks for sticking with me through this entire investigation. And remember, the truth is out there. Sometimes it's just buried under 20 years of carefully constructed lies. Until next time.